She gave them everything, her home, her trust, her silence. They took it all and left her with shame. Now she's telling her story. Subscribe to hear every buried truth. She met Ellie by accident, or so she told herself, for months afterward. It had been one of those grey, soaking afternoons when the sky felt too heavy for the season and the city moved slower, as if weighed down by secrets no one dared to speak. May had ducked into the used bookstore on the corner, more out of habit than intention. She liked the silence there, the stale scent of forgotten stories, the way people whispered even when they were alone. Ellie sat on the floor in the medical section, her jeans torn at the knees, not by fashion, but by time. The girl was hunched over a thick anatomy book with curling pages, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had the posture of someone who taught herself not to take up space, and yet she radiated a kind of presence. Not beauty, not charm, but something arresting, like a secret that begged to be noticed. May, at 52, had everything she was supposed to want. A well-kept house with tall windows, a husband who still remembered to compliment her earrings, a son in grad school, polite if distant. Her days were filled with quiet order, Pilates, flower arrangements, foundation meetings. But that afternoon, watching Ellie trace the diagrams of bones with her bitten fingernail, something inside May shifted, not dramatically, not obviously, just enough. They spoke briefly at first. A compliment about the girl's thrifted boots, a joke about medical terms too long to pronounce. Ellie smiled, small and tired. May learned her name, her major, that she was sharing a studio apartment with 3 other girls and working 2 jobs. "It's fine," Ellie had said, with that particular brand of cheerful deflection that only those who've endured real hardship ever truly master. "I'm used to it." May offered coffee, then a ride, then a week later, a guest room. Of course, people talked. They always do. But May was used to being scrutinised, her kindness, her choices, her clean fingernails. She smiled and said she needed help, and what decent person could argue with that? The truth, of course, was more complicated. At first, everything felt good. Right, even. Ellie moved through the house like she belonged there. She was quiet, considerate. She refolded towels without being asked. She remembered to water the orchids, even the ones May herself often forgot. At night, she read under a blanket on the living room sofa, legs tucked beneath her like a child, her eyes wide and unguarded. May caught herself watching her, not with suspicion, not yet, with something gentler. A kind of fondness that curled in the ribs. Ellie didn't wear makeup, but her skin was impossibly smooth. She rarely spoke about her past, but when she did, always briefly and always with a careful smile, May felt something between maternal sorrow and the kind of jealousy one feels for people who have survived more than they should have. It was May who insisted on the dentist. She couldn't stand the sight of Ellie's crooked front tooth, not because it was ugly, but because it was a visible mark of neglect. 3 appointments and $2,000 later, Ellie had a new smile, hesitant, grateful, radiant. May cried afterward, alone in her bathroom. She told herself it was hormones. She bought her clothes, not flashy things, but good soft fabrics. Sweaters that would last, a coat for the winter, deep green with real buttons, shoes with arch support. She took her to a proper salon where Ellie sat nervously while the stylist brushed out her heavy uncut hair. The result was stunning, not in a pageant way, in a way that made people look twice. You might ask, did May expect gratitude? Of course not, she'd say. But you and I both know better. We all want to be someone's salvation. It makes us feel holy. It makes us forget the parts of ourselves we can no longer forgive. Her husband, Thomas, took to Ellie easily. Too easily? Maybe. But at the time, May didn't think much of it. He was kind, affable, patted Ellie on the shoulder when she brought in groceries, laughed a little louder at her jokes than May thought necessary. But it didn't matter. It was harmless. At least, that's what she believed. That's what she wanted to believe. In the evenings, the 3 of them would have dinner together, and Ellie would listen, really listen, in a way May's son hadn't in years. She asked thoughtful questions. She laughed at stories May hadn't told in decades. She began to fill a space in the house that May hadn't realised was empty. And isn't that how it happens? The slow creep of attachment, the blending of roles. One day, you're helping a poor girl with nothing. The next, she's at your table, wearing the robe you gave her, humming a tune from your childhood. One night you walk past the guest room and the door is half open and you see her sleeping, peaceful, vulnerable, and you feel a pang. But you don't know what for. You'd be surprised how quickly the heart can trick itself, how easy it is to mistake admiration for affection or need for love. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, just remember this: May was happy, Ellie was safe, and everything seemed perfect. But appearances, especially in households full of money, wine, and silence, are just performance, and someone was already rehearsing her final act. The change didn't happen overnight, of course. These things rarely do. It was gradual, like the way dust gathers on glass, slow enough to ignore until suddenly everything looks duller. But May, ever so careful, ever so practiced in the art of domestic control, noticed the shift before anyone else. She just didn't want to admit it. It began with the laughter. Not just any laughter. Their laughter. Thomas and Ellie. At first it was harmless. A shared joke over the dinner table. Something about a clumsy professor or a mispronounced word. May would smile along politely even when she didn't quite catch the joke. That happened more often than she liked to admit. Their laughter was youthful, unfiltered, and she had learned to laugh in moderation. That was the first warning. Then came the movies. Ellie had a curious mind. That's what May loved about her. Or used to. She asked questions. She wanted to understand things. And Thomas, who once fell asleep halfway through any film not set in World War II, suddenly had the patience for documentaries, indie films, and college lectures. They'd sit on the couch together, Ellie curled under that same green throw May had picked out at the design expo, Thomas with his legs stretched out and a glass of wine resting on his chest. May, more often than not, would watch from the kitchen while pretending to clean what had already been wiped twice. You may wonder, why didn't she say anything? Why didn't she confront it early, while it was still something as small as a movie or a shared laugh? Well, and you might recognise yourself in this, it's because no one wants to seem jealous of their own kindness. She had brought Ellie in. She had opened the door, set the table, poured the wine. To feel threatened now would be petty, wouldn't it? But it was more than that. The real sting came not from Thomas. It came from her son. Daniel had always been close with May. Maybe not in the way of boys who shared everything, but with a gentle loyalty that had comforted her when other things in her life felt shaky. He called often, visited when he could, remembered her birthday without Facebook reminders. He was steady, reliable. Until Ellie. She noticed it the first time he came over for dinner and sat beside the girl instead of his mother. The way he asked Ellie about her courses, her favourite books, her thoughts on politics. May, seated across the table, listened to them exchange ideas like old friends or, no, worse, potential lovers. It was subtle, yes, nothing inappropriate. But there's a difference between polite interest and the kind of attentiveness that warms the air between two people. You know the kind, don't you? Of course, she told herself it was nothing, just admiration. Ellie was bright, kind, and May had raised Daniel well, hadn't she? He was smart enough to know boundaries, smart enough to know who Ellie was, but even smart men falter when charm wears the face of innocence. May began to feel it in the walls. The house, once hers, every corner, every silence, began to feel occupied in strange new ways. Ellie's scent lingered in the hallways, a soft mix of citrus shampoo and lavender lotion. Her things migrated slowly from the guest room to other parts of the home. A cardigan over the back of the dining chair, a notebook near the fireplace, earrings left on the bathroom counter. It was almost funny. Not in a humorous sense, but in the absurdity of it. May had once delighted in making Ellie feel at home. Now she found herself asking silent questions in every room she entered. Had Ellie been here? Had she touched this? There was a day, you'll want to remember this one, when May found a mug in the dishwasher. A plain white mug with lipstick, nothing fancy, but she knew that shade, it wasn't hers. And no, it wasn't the lipstick that mattered, it was what it represented. The casual confidence of someone who no longer considered herself a guest. Still, May said nothing. She smiled. She poured tea. She asked Ellie about school, about essays, about career goals. She even listened. But inside something began to tighten. Not rage. Not yet. Something smaller. More insidious. Resentment. She started walking longer in the mornings, staying out late on errands she didn't need to run. Sometimes she would sit alone in her car outside the house and wait until the lights in the living room dimmed. She wanted to see what patterns the shadows made on the curtains, to know who was still awake, to listen, just in case. And yes, before you ask, she felt ashamed of her doubt, of her pettiness, of the aching need to know. But here's where you might forgive her, even if only a little. We don't start distrusting the people we love out of cruelty. We do it because something deep inside us, something old and primal, tells us when the balance has shifted, when the air is too warm, when the door is closing on us slowly, quietly, without ever seeming to move. The house hadn't changed, but the feeling had. And May, poor clever May, was starting to suspect that she had invited a guest into her home and built her a throne. It started with the drawer, not even a drawer that mattered really, just one of those half-forgotten side compartments in the laundry room, the one with spare buttons, wrinkled receipts and batteries no one ever remembered buying. May had been looking for sewing thread when she found it, a delicate piece of lace, ivory-coloured, small, new. It wasn't hers. She held it between her fingers for a long time, not in shock, no, not yet, but in silence. The kind of silence that stretches thin over a scream you're not ready to let out. The lace was too youthful, too intentional, not the kind of thing a woman buys for herself, but the kind bought for her, with purpose, with plans. She placed it back, closed the drawer, slowly, carefully, as if any sudden movement might break something sacred. Now, you may be thinking, why didn't she confront him? Why not march into the room, hold it up like evidence, demand truth? But let me ask you this. Have you ever suspected something so awful, so shattering, that the only power you felt was in not knowing for sure? Because as long as it's a maybe, you can breathe. As long as there's no confirmation, there's still a version of the story where you're not a fool. So she chose silence and observation. 2 days later, she noticed the wine glass. It sat in his office, not in plain sight, tucked just behind a row of law journals on the edge of the bookshelf. The glass was empty, but the faint red tint inside suggested it hadn't been for long, and on the rim, barely there, was a kiss of colour. Not her shade. Too pink. Too glossy. Too young. May stood in that room for what felt like a year. The air around her pulsed. Not with fury, not yet, but with something older. A heaviness, a humiliation that hadn't quite found its shape. She didn't move the glass. She didn't clean it. She simply walked out, heart pounding too softly to scream. Now, if you're wondering what she did next, you'll be pleased, or horrified, or both. She began to write things down. A journal, small, leather-bound, hidden behind the gardening manuals no one ever touched. She wrote down the date, the time, what she found, how it made her feel. Not to confront anyone, not yet, but to collect, to prepare, to give shape to a truth she wasn't ready to speak aloud. And then, of course, there was the phone. It was a mistake, really. A shared charger in the kitchen, a notification that blinked just once while he was in the shower. She hadn't meant to look. But some instincts, you'll agree, are older than morality. And when a phone lights up with her husband's name and a message that says, "You were magic," well, tell me, could you have resisted? The number wasn't saved, the message had no context, but it didn't need any. The words glowed with intimacy, with aftermath, with the kind of satisfaction that doesn't come from conversation. May read it once, then again, then she placed the phone back exactly where it had been. Untouched, innocent, and still, she said nothing. You might call that weakness, but I'd argue it's the opposite. It takes strength, doesn't it, to sit beside someone at dinner, to butter their bread, to ask about their day, knowing what you know or suspect, to smile, to fold laundry, to touch their shoulder without flinching. But that's what she did. She waited, she watched, she smiled, and all the while the lace sat in the drawer. The lipstick lingered on the glass. The message lived in her mind, replaying like a poison lullaby. She began to sleep lighter, wake earlier. She noticed things. A second toothbrush moved, a perfume she didn't buy, the faintest scratch on the hallway floor like a heel dragged too quickly against the wood. She wrote it all down. The details, the dates, the patterns, because if truth is a knife, May intended to sharpen it herself, quietly, carefully, without ever letting it slip from her hand. Not yet. It happened on a Tuesday, as these things often do. Not dramatic enough to expect a catastrophe, but just inconvenient enough to crack the routine. May had been folding laundry in the guest room, the scent of lavender detergent lingering in the air, when she heard them laughing in the kitchen. Again, that laugh, the one she could recognize now by its pitch. Higher than his usual chuckle, louder than Ellie's usual shy hum. It wasn't just laughter, it was complicity. Intimacy dressed up as casual. And just like that, something inside her snapped, quietly, without ceremony. Not a fire, not yet. More like the silent shift of plates before an earthquake. But you felt it in your spine. She walked in, still holding a hand towel. Her posture was straight, almost regal. Her voice, when it came, was cold, calm, and devastating. She listed what she knew, the lace underwear, the lipstick on the glass, the late-night text. She said it all, out loud. Not to accuse, not to scream, but to make it real. To make it theirs. Now, you may assume he panicked, that his guilt spilled out in stutters and confessions, but no, he denied everything, every single word, with the smoothness of a man who had prepared for this moment, or worse, a man who believed his own lie. Ellie stood beside him, tears welled up, not hysterical ones, pretty ones. Silent, the kind that made you want to comfort, not question. And then, in the smallest voice, she said May was imagining things. That stress, maybe even jealousy, had clouded her judgment, that she had always admired May. Always. And here's the part that will make your jaw tighten. Daniel walked in during the middle of it all, and he listened, and when May turned to him, hoping, aching for someone to say, "I believe you," he looked at Ellie and chose her. He said his mother needed rest, that this wasn't healthy, that she was creating stories from shadows. And Ellie, sweet, trembling Ellie, simply shook her head and said she would leave if it made things easier. May laughed. She actually laughed, a single bitter exhale of disbelief, but she said nothing else. She didn't cry in front of them, she didn't beg, she didn't scream, she just turned around, went upstairs and closed the door, the kind of closing that meant something had ended, and for a while it was quiet, until an anonymous email. No subject line, just a link. Now, if you've been with us this long, you already know what it was, but even you might not be ready for just how cruel it turned out to be. A blog. Clean, minimalist design, no ads, no clutter, just posts. Each one dated, each one echoing with a voice May knew all too well, because it was hers, not written by her, no, but copied, stolen, word for word from the leather-bound journal she kept hidden behind the gardening manuals. Her most private thoughts, her fears, her insecurities, her confessions, the ones she never said aloud, even to herself. There they were, posted, and not anonymously. Oh no. The blog was titled The House with No Mirror. Clever, wasn't it? The author described a woman who lived in shadows, obsessed with youth, drunk on control, blind to what love really looks like. There were entries about May's marriage, her loneliness, her guilt about aging, her body, her secrets. It wasn't just invasive, it was surgical, and readers had found it. Dozens of comments, strangers speculating about the narcissist wife, about how the girl was just trying to survive in a toxic home, about how some women deserve to be replaced. And May? She read every word. All of it, until her hands went numb, until the room blurred, until her knees gave just slightly under the weight of knowing this wasn't just betrayal, it was annihilation. So, what do you think she did next? Do you think she screamed? Do you think she confronted them again? No. She closed the laptop, sat in the dark, and whispered one thing to herself. This is war. And reader, it was. It unravelled faster than she expected. That's how real ruin often comes. Not in a storm, but in a slow, precise disassembly of everything you thought was stable. The email came from a long-time client. Polite, formal, brief. A note that he had come across concerning material online. That, unfortunately, it would be best to discontinue their sessions. May stared at the message, reading it 3 times before fully absorbing what it meant. Then came another and another. One from a woman she'd coached through a divorce, who now wrote, "I trusted you." That one stung the most. Not because of the accusation, but because of the truth hidden inside it. People trusted May, or they used to. She didn't need to ask how they found it. The blog, that grotesque little mirror held up to her soul, had spread, quietly, virally. A local parenting forum, a whispered mention on a therapy subreddit. One comment led to a screenshot. One screenshot led to her name. And that was enough. Her practice, built over years, carefully, respectfully, dissolved in days. One by one, appointments vanished from her calendar like fading footprints. No formal accusations, just silence. But it wasn't just clients. Her friends, or more accurately the women she drank wine with and texted about holiday table settings, began to ghost her in the most elegant ways. A book club was rescheduled. A brunch was cancelled due to rain. Even though the sun had been relentless that week, she watched them move on without her, one manicured hand at a time. The final blow came on a Thursday morning. She found Thomas in the kitchen, suitcase by the door, his expression carved from polished indifference. He said it was just for a while, that the tension in the house wasn't healthy. He said it wasn't about sides. He said he needed clarity. Where do you think he went? Yes, of course he went to her. To Ellie. May didn't cry when he left. Not then. Not when the door shut. Not even when the silence swallowed the hallway like a void. But that night, when she passed the mirror and didn't recognize the woman in it, she slid down the bathroom wall and finally broke. No screams, no sobs. Just a collapse, like a building that knew there was no point staying upright. She stopped eating for 2 days. The house blurred around her. She slept in fragments, woke in panic, wandered from room to room like a ghost. The blinds stayed closed, the dishes stacked. Her phone, once buzzing with reminders and affirmations, lay face down, silent. But grief, as cruel as it is, eventually numbs. On the 3rd day, she pulled herself up, not from hope, not from strength, but from something colder, a need to understand. She sat at Thomas's desk. She had never snooped before, not in over 20 years of marriage. But betrayal rewrites every rule you thought you'd follow. She opened his laptop, logged in, the password hadn't changed, and maybe he thought she'd never dare. Maybe that was his mistake, or maybe that was his challenge. She scoured folders, calendar appointments, emails, nothing damning, nothing direct. But then in a dusty subfolder beneath expense reports, buried deep where no accidental click would ever reach, she found it. A folder named Restore. At first, it looked like backups, generic file names, compressed data, but inside one of them, a media file. No label, no date, just there. She hesitated. You would too, wouldn't you? She clicked, and what she saw, no, let's not ruin it all at once. Let's just say this. The screen flickered, and her world didn't just crack. It imploded, because some truths, no matter how prepared you think you are, still manage to punch the air out of your lungs. It wasn't just betrayal. It wasn't just sex. It was performance. It was premeditated. It was captured. And someone somewhere had made sure it would never stay hidden. May sat frozen for nearly an hour, watching, not because she wanted to, not even because she had to, but because when someone drags you that deep into darkness, you need to know every detail of how it happened. She closed the laptop, wiped her face with shaking hands, stood, and if you're imagining that she fell apart again, you'd be wrong. Because that night something else entered her eyes. Not sadness, not rage, but calculation, and believe me, you'll want to stay for what comes next. She didn't react right away, not publicly, not with threats or weeping phone calls. That wasn't her style, not anymore. What May did was far more elegant and far more dangerous. She began with the obvious, evidence, the video for one. She made 3 encrypted copies. One she uploaded to a cloud drive no one could trace. One she kept on a flash drive, which she placed inside a hollow lipstick tube in the bottom drawer of her vanity. The last she mailed to a PO box registered in another name, a name only she knew. No mistakes, no slips. She collected more browser histories, bank records, messages retrieved through software she used to scoff at. One long weekend of research turned into a full dossier. Names, dates, screenshots, metadata. Her hands trembled at first, but by the 3rd day, she moved with surgical precision. Then came the lawyer, a woman, sharp, silent, and twice divorced. She didn't blink at the contents of the video. She didn't gasp. She nodded, took notes, asked questions like scalpels. By the end of the meeting, she had a strategy. And May had a power she hadn't tasted in months. Control. But here's where things took a turn. May didn't want revenge in the classic sense. She didn't want handcuffs or courtrooms. She wanted erosion. She wanted silence turned against them. She wanted them to rot in the shadows they'd built. So she created distance. Not from the plan, from the execution. She contacted a blogger, Not just any blogger, a woman who built her platform on truth leaks and scandals wrapped in feminism and fire. May sent her the materials anonymously, encrypted and complete. A single message: you've exposed worse for less. Tell this one well. The blogger did. The post went live on a Monday. A headline that cracked through polite society like a scream in a cathedral. Behind the curtain, the therapist, her husband, and the girl who knew too much. The article was explosive, but it wasn't cruel. It was precise. It left names out, but details in. Enough for anyone close to the situation to recognise the cast. And oh, did they recognise? The fallout was immediate. Ellie's university inbox was flooded within hours. Screenshots of the video, blurred but unmistakable, began circulating. Her social media shut down. A job offer she had posted proudly the week before was withdrawn pending review. She released a statement, then a second, then silence. Thomas, too, felt the ripple. A business deal he'd spent 8 months securing, gone. The investor pulled out, citing reputation concerns. A journalist reached out for comment. Then another. The board held a meeting without him. For the first time in years, he wasn't the man everyone trusted. He was the man everyone avoided. And Daniel? Daniel came home, not in anger, not even in shame, but in quiet, stunned awareness. He read the blog, he saw the video, and in the silence between one breath and the next, he realised exactly who had raised him and who had fooled him. But May didn't call him. She didn't call anyone. Instead, she poured herself a glass of wine, sat at the same desk where she had once found the message that shattered her, opened a new blog, blank, untouched, her voice, hers alone, and she began to write. Not fiction, not embellishment, just her story, her version. The first post was brief, but it spread faster than she expected. People were hungry for her truth. The title, Welcome to My Version of the Story. And the tagline, Dirt was just the beginning. Now, you may wonder, did she feel satisfied? Let me ask you something more interesting. Did she feel clean? No, of course not, but she felt seen. And sometimes being seen is the only justice we get. And sometimes it's enough.